Hey guys, in tonight's mystery, we present the truth behind D.B. Cooper's Sky Heist, told from the perspective of 5 remarkable people, an infamous hijacking that stunned the nation, told not through headlines, but through the eyes of those who lived closest to the chaos. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight, you'll hear it all. So, lie back, let us know where you are watching from and what time it is for you, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoy my content. Now listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. Harold Weatherby had been tracking storm patterns for the National Weather Service for 37 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the archived barometric readings from November 24, 1971. The data should have been routine: pressure measurements, wind velocity, precipitation levels. But buried within the meteorological records was an anomaly that made his coffee grow cold as he stared at his computer screen. The wind patterns that Thanksgiving Eve told a story that contradicted everything the FBI had concluded about the Cooper case. According to Harold's calculations, the downdrafts and crosswinds between Portland and Seattle would have made it impossible for anyone to land where the Bureau claimed Cooper had jumped. The man who called himself Dan Cooper hadn't vanished into the wilderness as everyone believed. He had landed in a completely different location. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he cross-referenced the atmospheric conditions with topographical maps. The convergence of wind patterns created a natural funnel effect that would have carried a parachutist southeast, not southwest. This meant Cooper had landed in a completely different county, possibly even a different state. For over 50 years, search efforts, speculation, and countless theories had concentrated on the wrong geographic area. The revelation struck Harold with the force of a lightning bolt. He had stumbled upon evidence that could rewrite history. But as he reached for his phone to call the FBI, something made him pause. The timestamp on the meteorological data showed it had been accessed multiple times over the decades, always by the same government identification number. Someone else knew about the wind patterns. Someone had been actively suppressing this information. Harold's heart pounded as he realized the implications. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved, it was deliberately kept that way. The mystery that had captivated America for generations was a carefully constructed facade. But why? What was so important about maintaining the illusion that Cooper had disappeared into the Washington wilderness? As he investigated the archived files, Harold discovered a pattern of data manipulation that extended far beyond simple meteorological readings. Flight manifests had been altered, witness testimonies had been redacted, and physical evidence had been systematically reclassified. The Cooper case was not merely a mishandled robbery, but rather a massive cover-up. The realization that he was now privy to dangerous information settled over Harold like a shroud. His discovery had the potential to reveal a conspiracy spanning across the highest echelons of government, but it also positioned him as a potential target. The same forces that had kept Cooper's true fate hidden for half a century wouldn't hesitate to silence an elderly meteorologist who had stumbled upon their secret. Harold's mind raced as he considered his options. He could pretend he had never seen the data, delete his research and return to his quiet retirement. Or he could follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper might cost him everything. The weight of 5 decades of deception pressed down on him as he made his choice. He began copying the files to an encrypted drive, his movements quick and efficient despite his age. If something happened to him, at least the evidence would survive. The truth about Cooper's Sky Heist wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a conspiracy that had shaped American history in ways no one could imagine. As Harold worked through the night, digitizing decades of suppressed evidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The same instinct that had kept him alive through tornado seasons and hurricane tracking now screamed warnings about the storm he was about to unleash. The Cooper case was about to be blown wide open, and Harold Weatherby was standing at the epicenter of a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything America thought it knew about that fateful Thanksgiving Eve in 1971. Margaret Chen had been working as a senior analyst at the Department of Justice for 23 years when the encrypted file arrived in her secure inbox. The sender was identified only as barometric truth, but the meteorological data contained within shattered everything she thought she knew about the Cooper investigation. As she studied Harold Weatherby's research, Margaret realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the federal government. The implications were staggering. When Margaret compared Harold's wind pattern analysis with the government's internal reports, she discovered a clear deception. The FBI hadn't simply failed to solve the case. They had actively worked to ensure it remained unsolved. The question that haunted Margaret was why. Her security clearance granted her access to Operation Northwood's documents, Project Blue Book files, and other classified materials that most Americans would never see. But the Cooper files were different. They were compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels, restricted to a select group of officials who had maintained their silence for over 5 decades. Margaret's attempts to access the complete files triggered automatic alerts that would certainly draw unwanted attention. Working carefully within the system, Margaret began to piece together the true scope of the Cooper cover-up. The hijacking hadn't been a random act of desperation or a well-planned robbery. It had been a carefully orchestrated operation designed to conceal something far more significant. The man who called himself Dan Cooper was no ordinary skyjacker. He was a government operative whose mission had gone catastrophically wrong. The deeper Margaret dug, the more she realized that Cooper's jump from Flight 305 had been an extraction, not an escape. The parachutes, the money, and the meticulous planning all indicated a professional operation with government backing. But something had gone wrong during the extraction, something that required the creation of an elaborate mythology to explain Cooper's disappearance. Margaret's investigation unearthed a series of personnel files, sealed since 1971. The files held the records of deep cover operatives engaged in classified projects during the Cold War. One name stood out, Daniel B. Cooper, a CIA operative who had been declared killed in action 3 days before the hijacking. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The revelation that Cooper, a government agent, had supposedly died before the hijacking suggested a level of deception that left Margaret feeling uneasy. The entire Cooper mythology had been constructed to hide the fact that a CIA operative had gone rogue and disappeared with classified information that could have compromised national security. The money from the hijacking was never the real prize. It was the intelligence Cooper had stolen that made him so dangerous. Margaret's hands shook as she realized the full scope of what she had uncovered. The Cooper case wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a rogue operative who had potentially sold state secrets to foreign governments. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the CIA and exposed decades of illegal domestic operations. As she compiled her findings, Margaret became aware that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Her computer access logs showed unusual activity, and she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. The same security apparatus that had kept the Cooper secret for 50 years was now focused on her. She was playing a dangerous game against opponents who had perfected the art of making problems disappear. The weight of her discovery pressed down on Margaret as she realized that she held the key to one of America's greatest mysteries. But she also understood that revealing the truth could destroy her career, her life, and possibly her existence. The forces that had maintained the Cooper cover-up for half a century wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their carefully constructed lie. Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper was worth the risk. The American people deserved to know that their government had been lying to them for 50 years, and Margaret Chen was prepared to pay the price for bringing that truth to light. Dr. Elena Vasquez had built her reputation on precision. As a theoretical physicist specializing in ballistics and trajectory analysis, she had consulted on everything from missile defense systems to accident reconstruction. When Harold Weatherby's meteorological data reached her through encrypted channels, Elena immediately recognized the significance of what she was seeing. The wind patterns told a story that contradicted 50 years of accepted wisdom about the Cooper case. Elena's laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology became the unlikely center of a historical investigation that would challenge everything America believed about its most famous mystery. Using advanced computational models and atmospheric simulation software, she began to reconstruct the exact conditions that Dan Cooper would have encountered during his jump from Flight 305. The calculations were complex, requiring Eleanor to factor in variables that the original FBI investigation had either ignored or misunderstood. Air density, thermal layers, wind shear, and gravitational effects all played crucial roles in determining where Cooper would have landed. But as Elena's simulations ran through thousands of iterations, one conclusion became inescapable. Cooper had not landed in the Washington wilderness where the search had been concentrated. The trajectory analysis revealed that Cooper's landing zone was actually in northeastern Oregon, approximately 60 miles from where the FBI had focused their investigation. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. It was a fundamental error that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate misdirection. Eleanor's scientific training told her that such a massive oversight was unlikely to be accidental. Working with Margaret Chen's classified intelligence and Harold's meteorological data, Elena began to construct a three-dimensional model of Cooper's entire flight path. The simulation showed that Cooper had executed a controlled descent that demonstrated advanced parachuting skills. This wasn't a desperate leap into the unknown. It was a precisely calculated maneuver performed by someone with extensive training in high-altitude jumps. Elena's analysis of the physical evidence yielded even more disturbing conclusions. The money that had been found along the Columbia River showed signs of exposure patterns that were inconsistent with the official story. Chemical analysis revealed traces of compounds that suggested the bills had been buried deliberately, not scattered by natural forces. Someone had planted the evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had perished in the wilderness. The parachute fragments that had been recovered over the years told a similar story. Elena's examination of the fabric degradation patterns showed that the parachutes had been cut and weathered artificially to simulate decades of exposure. The evidence that had been used to support Cooper's death was as fabricated as the mythology surrounding his disappearance. As Elena's investigation progressed, she became aware of the personal risks she was taking. Her laboratory's computer systems had been infiltrated multiple times, and she had noticed unmarked vehicles parked outside her apartment. The same forces that had suppressed the truth about Cooper for 50 years were now focused on her, and Eleanor knew that her scientific curiosity had made her a target. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that Cooper's jump coordinates had been deliberately falsified in the official reports. The flight crew's statements about the exact location of the jump had been altered after the fact, shifting the apparent landing zone by dozens of miles. This level of deception could only have been orchestrated by someone with access to the highest levels of the investigation. Elena's computer models painted a picture of a precisely executed escape that bore no resemblance to the desperate gamble portrayed in popular culture. Cooper had jumped precisely when the conditions were ideal, fully aware of the atmospheric factors that would determine his landing site. He had landed safely in a predetermined location where extraction was possible. The scientific planning and successful execution of Cooper's escape completely transformed the case. The tale wasn't a story of a man who had vanished into the wilderness. It was the account of a professional operation that had been covered up by the very agencies tasked with solving it. Elena's calculations had revealed the truth that had been hidden for half a century. D.B. Cooper had survived his jump and disappeared into a new life, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. Thomas Hartwell had spent 31 years in the basement archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a ghost among the filing cabinets and storage boxes that contained the secrets of American law enforcement. His domain was a labyrinth of classified documents, cold case files, and evidence that would never see the light of day. When he received the encrypted package containing Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, and Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, Thomas realized that his unique position made him the perfect person to uncover the complete truth about the Cooper case. The FBI archives contained more than just official reports and evidence logs. Hidden within the vast collection were personal memos, interdepartmental communications, and administrative records that painted a picture of the Cooper investigation that had never been revealed to the public. Thomas's systematic approach to document analysis had made him invaluable to the Bureau, but it also gave him access to information that could expose the most significant cover-up in FBI history. Thomas began his investigation by examining the personnel files of every agent who had worked on the Cooper case. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the Bureau's commitment to justice. The lead investigators had been transferred or retired immediately after the case was officially suspended, and their personal files contained discrepancies that suggested they had been silenced rather than reassigned. The evidence logs revealed an even more disturbing pattern. Critical pieces of physical evidence had been mysteriously lost or destroyed over the years, always during periods when new investigators were assigned to the case. The timing of these losses suggested that someone within the Bureau was actively working to prevent the case from being solved. Thomas's analysis showed that the Cooper investigation had been sabotaged from within. Administrative records from 1971 contained references to Operation Maple, a classified program that Thomas had never encountered in his decades of archival work. The program had been initiated 3 days before the Cooper hijacking and terminated 2 weeks after Cooper's jump. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Thomas's attempts to access the complete Operation Maple files triggered security alerts that indicated the program was still classified at the highest levels. Thomas's investigation led him to a series of financial records that had been buried in the archives for 50 years. The records showed that significant amounts of money had been moved through covert accounts immediately after the Cooper hijacking, amounts that far exceeded the $200,000 Cooper had demanded from the airline. The financial trail suggested that the hijacking had been a cover for a much larger operation involving millions of dollars in untraceable funds. The personnel files revealed that Daniel B. Cooper had indeed been a CIA operative, but his official record had been sanitized to remove any reference to his specialized training in high-altitude operations and psychological warfare. The man who had walked onto Flight 305 was not a desperate criminal, but a highly trained professional with decades of experience in covert operations. Sarah Mitchell had built her career on asking uncomfortable questions. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, she had exposed corruption in Congress, revealed defense contractor fraud, and uncovered scandals that had brought down cabinet officials. But nothing in her 20-year career had prepared her for the story that landed in her encrypted inbox on a cold February morning. The package contained Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, and Thomas Hartwell's archival discoveries, a comprehensive dossier that revealed the truth about the D.B. Cooper case. Sarah's initial reaction was skepticism. The Cooper case had been investigated by countless reporters, authors, and amateur sleuths over the decades, and the idea that a meteorologist, a government analyst, a physicist, and an archivist had uncovered evidence that had eluded the FBI for 50 years seemed improbable. But as she examined the documentation, Sarah realized that she was looking at the most significant story of her career. The evidence was overwhelming and mutually corroborating. Harold's wind pattern analysis proved that Cooper had landed in Oregon, not Washington. Margaret's classified files revealed that Cooper had been a CIA operative. Eleanor's trajectory calculations showed that the escape had been scientifically planned and executed. Thomas's archival research exposed the cover-up that had maintained the Cooper mythology for half a century. Sarah's investigation into the story's sources convinced her that the four individuals had acted independently, each following their own path to the same shocking conclusion. The convergence of their evidence created a narrative that was both compelling and terrifying. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved, it was a carefully constructed lie that had been maintained by the highest levels of government. As Sarah began to verify the evidence, she encountered resistance that confirmed the story's significance. Government officials who had previously been accessible refused to return her calls. Sources within the intelligence community warned her that pursuing the story would end her career. The message was clear. The Cooper case was off limits, and Sarah's investigation had attracted attention from forces that operated outside normal channels. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she understood why the Cooper case had been kept secret for so long. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative would expose a CIA program that had conducted illegal domestic operations during the Cold War. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the intelligence community and exposed decades of constitutional violations. Stonewalling and outright hostility met Sarah's attempts to corroborate the story through official channels. The FBI refused to comment on the meteorological evidence, the CIA denied any knowledge of Daniel B. Cooper, and the Department of Justice claimed that all relevant files had been destroyed. The wall of silence that surrounded the Cooper case was itself evidence of the conspiracy that Sarah was trying to expose. The personal cost of pursuing the story began to mount as Sarah's investigation continued. Her apartment was burglarized, her computer was hacked, and she received anonymous warnings about the consequences of publishing the Cooper revelations. The same forces that had kept the secret for 50 years were now focused on preventing her from revealing the truth to the American people. Sarah's editor at the Washington Herald initially supported her investigation, but as the evidence mounted and the pressure increased, he began to express concerns about the story's potential impact on the newspaper's relationship with government sources. The Herald's publisher, a man who had built his career on maintaining cordial relationships with Washington's power brokers, made it clear that the Cooper story would not be published. Faced with institutional resistance and personal threats, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would publish the Cooper revelations independently, using her own resources and accepting the consequences of exposing one of the most significant cover-ups in American history. The same forces that had concealed the truth about D.B. Cooper for half a century could not afford to bury it. Sarah's investigation had revealed that the Cooper case was more than just a mystery. It was a window into the shadow government that operated beyond public scrutiny and constitutional oversight. The story began with the man who had jumped from Flight 305, unveiling the murky depths of American intelligence operations and the extreme measures the government took to safeguard its secrets. As Sarah prepared to publish her findings, she understood that she was about to become the most dangerous journalist in America. The Cooper revelations would reveal a conspiracy that penetrated the highest echelons of government, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to bear the consequences for revealing this truth. The truth about D.B. Cooper was more extraordinary than any fiction about him. Daniel Benjamin Cooper had been a CIA operative specializing in deep cover operations during the height of the Cold War. His mission on November 24, 1971, had been to intercept a Soviet agent who was planning to defect with intelligence about American defense systems. The hijacking had been a cover story, designed to explain Cooper's presence on Flight 305 and provide justification for his subsequent disappearance. Operation Maple had been a joint CIA-FBI program designed to conduct domestic surveillance operations against suspected communist sympathizers. Cooper's role had been to infiltrate Soviet intelligence networks and gather information about enemy operations on American soil. The program had been illegal under federal law, but it had been authorized at the highest levels of government and had operated in complete secrecy for over a decade. The Soviet agent Cooper, who was supposed to intercept, never made it to the rendezvous. Intelligence sources later revealed that the KGB had eliminated the defector before he could reach American soil. Cooper's mission had been compromised, but he had already begun the hijacking that was supposed to provide his cover story. With no defector to apprehend and no intelligence to gather, Cooper had been faced with a choice: abort the mission and risk exposure, or complete the operation and disappear into a new identity. Cooper had chosen to disappear, but his escape had been aided by the same government that officially claimed to be searching for him. The CIA had provided Cooper with the parachutes, the money, and the extraction plan that had allowed him to vanish without a trace. The subsequent search efforts had been theatre, designed to maintain the illusion that Cooper was a common criminal who had perished in the wilderness. The money that Cooper had demanded from Northwest Orient had been a fraction of the funds involved in Operation Maple. The $200,000 hijacking had been used to conceal the movement of millions of dollars in covert funding that had been allocated to illegal domestic surveillance operations. The Cooper case had provided the perfect cover for financial transactions that would have been impossible to justify through normal channels. Cooper's successful escape had created a problem for the intelligence community. A trained operative with knowledge of illegal domestic operations was now living under an assumed identity, potentially vulnerable to foreign recruitment or personal blackmail. They made the decision to uphold the Cooper mythology and prevent the public from learning the truth about his escape. Over the years, they carefully planted the physical evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had died during his jump. The money found along the Columbia River had been aged artificially and placed where it would be found by investigators. The parachute fragments had been cut and weathered to simulate decades of exposure. Every piece of evidence had been fabricated to support the official story. Cooper himself had been relocated to a secure facility where he had been debriefed and prepared for life under a new identity. The man who had jumped from Flight 305 had been given a new name, a new background, and a new life in exchange for his silence about Operation Maple and his knowledge of illegal CIA activities. He had been hidden in plain sight, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative explained why the case had remained unsolved for over 50 years. The FBI hadn't failed to catch Cooper. They had succeeded in protecting him. The investigation had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain public interest, while ensuring that the truth never emerged. The Cooper case had become a cultural phenomenon precisely because it had been designed to capture public imagination. The mysterious gentleman bandit who had outsmarted the system and disappeared into legend had been a creation of government propaganda, a story that had been carefully crafted to distract attention from the real crimes that had been committed under the cover of national security. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper had been working independently, each following their path to the same shocking conclusion. Their evidence had converged to reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and exposed the dark reality of American intelligence operations during the Cold War. The Cooper case had been more than just a cover-up. It had been a test of the government's ability to control public perception and maintain official narratives in the face of contradictory evidence. The success of the Cooper mythology had provided a template for future deceptions, proving that even the most improbable stories could be accepted as truth if they were presented with sufficient authority and maintained with unwavering consistency. The disclosure of D.B. Cooper's true identity shook the American intelligence community and fundamentally altered the framework of government accountability. Sarah Mitchell's independent publication of the Cooper files triggered a cascade of events that exposed not just the truth about one famous skyjacker, but an entire network of illegal operations that had been conducted under the cover of national security. Government officials launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the evidence and silence the whistleblowers who revealed the truth within hours of the story's publication. Harold Weatherby was arrested on charges of stealing classified meteorological data. Margaret Chen was suspended from her position at the Department of Justice. Elena Vasquez faced an investigation into her laboratory's security protocols, and Thomas Hartwell was terminated from his position at the FBI archives. The Cooper revelations exposed the government's extreme measures to safeguard its secrets. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth found themselves facing criminal charges, professional ruin, and personal threats. The same forces that had upheld the Cooper cover-up for half a century now targeted anyone who dared to reveal the wider conspiracy. Sarah Mitchell's publication of the Cooper files had been timed to coincide with the release of documents to multiple international news organizations, ensuring that the story could not be suppressed through normal channels. The evidence was simultaneously published in London, Berlin, and Tokyo, creating a global media sensation that forced American officials to respond to questions they had hoped would never be asked. The Cooper case garnered international attention, revealing the extent to which American intelligence operations transcended constitutional boundaries during the Cold War. The exposure of Operation Maple led to investigations into other domestic surveillance programs that had been conducted without congressional oversight or judicial authorization. The Cooper case unlocked decades of hidden government activities. Congressional hearings into the Cooper cover-up revealed that the conspiracy had been maintained by a small group of officials who had remained in positions of power for decades. These individuals had used their influence to ensure that the truth about Cooper never emerged, manipulating investigations, suppressing evidence, and eliminating anyone who came too close to the truth. The revelation that Cooper had been living under government protection for over 50 years raised questions about how many other mysteries had been deliberately maintained to conceal illegal activities. The Cooper case had been just one example of the government's willingness to deceive the public to protect its operational secrets and political interests. The search for Cooper himself became a global manhunt as intelligence agencies around the world attempted to locate the man who had become the most famous skyjacker in history. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative made him a valuable target for foreign intelligence services, and his knowledge of Cold War operations made him a security risk that could not be ignored. Cooper was eventually located living under an assumed identity in a small town in Montana, where he had been working as a high school physics teacher for over 4 decades. His peaceful existence had been shattered by the revelation of his true identity, and he found himself at the center of a media circus that threatened to expose not just his past, but the lives of everyone he had come to know and love. In exchange for immunity from prosecution and protection for his family, the man once known as D.B. Cooper agreed to testify before Congress. His testimony unveiled the complete scope of Operation Maple and exposed the illicit activities carried out under the guise of national security. His words brought down a government based on lies and deception. The Cooper revelations triggered a constitutional crisis that forced America to confront the reality of its shadow government and the extent to which democratic institutions had been subverted by intelligence operations. The case that had begun as a simple hijacking had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and challenged the very foundations of American democracy. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper became symbols of the power of independent investigation and the importance of government accountability. Their bravery in exposing the conspiracy cost them their jobs and safety, but it also revealed the truth about one of America's most enduring mysteries and forced the nation to confront the reality of its hidden history. The solution to the Cooper case revealed a truth more disturbing than any mystery. The man who jumped from Flight 305 was a government agent, and the agencies that claimed to be looking for him helped him escape. The greatest mystery in American criminal history had been solved, but the truth had shattered the illusions that had sustained the nation for over 50 years. D.B. Cooper was never the gentleman bandit portrayed in popular imagination. He had been a weapon of the state, a tool of oppression disguised as a folk hero. The revelation of his true identity had exposed the dark reality of American power and the lengths to which the government would go to protect its secrets. The Cooper case was finally closed, but the reckoning had just begun. Brother Matthias pressed his quill against the parchment, ink pooling like a small wound. The monastery scriptorium felt unusually quiet this July morning, in 1518, as if the very walls held their breath. Outside Strasbourg's timber-framed houses, something unprecedented was unfolding, something that would challenge every assumption about human nature, divine will, and the boundaries between reason and chaos. The woman had begun 3 days prior. Frau Trophäa, a baker's wife, whose hands had kneaded thousands of loaves and whose feet had walked the cobblestones in measured steps for 43 years. Yet, on that sweltering Tuesday, those same feet had betrayed every principle of human dignity. They moved without her permission, lifting and stepping, turning and pivoting in patterns that belonged neither to any known dance nor to any recognizable madness. Matthias had witnessed possession before. The monastery served as refuge for those touched by devils, those whose minds had fractured under the weight of worldly concerns. But the dancing differed fundamentally from the thrashing, incoherent movements of the afflicted. Frau Trophäa's dance possessed an almost mathematical precision, as if her body followed instructions written in a language only her muscles could read. The crowd that gathered around her grew throughout that first day. Initially, neighbours assumed she celebrated some private joy, perhaps news of a pregnancy after years of barrenness, or word that her husband's debts had been forgiven. But as hours passed without pause, without water or rest, their smiles transformed into frowns of concern, then masks of fear. Dr. Hieronymus Bock, the city's most respected physician, arrived before sunset. His examination revealed no fever, No signs of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, and no symptoms of St. Vitus's dance. Her pulse remained steady despite the continuous exertion. Although her eyes appeared wild, they tracked movement and responded to sound. Most puzzling of all, when spoken to directly, she could respond coherently, even as her body continued its relentless choreography. "I cannot stop," she gasped between movements that resembled a peasant reel crossed with something far more ancient. "My feet, they know something I do not." By the second day, 3 others had joined her. Hans Burkhardt, a blacksmith, was among them, his powerful frame making his graceful pirouettes seem almost blasphemous. Elisabeth Zimmern, who was barely 16, performed a dance that resembled a courtly pavane. Most disturbing of all was Father Wilhelm, whose ecclesiastical robes billowed as he spun in movements that seemed to mock the very rituals he had performed for 20 years. The city council convened emergency sessions. The medical college debated theories ranging from corrupted humours to celestial malignment. The clergy declared days of prayer and fasting, yet nothing slowed the spreading contagion, which it certainly was, although it differed from any plague that had ever afflicted Christian lands. Brother Matthias found himself appointed as official recorder, tasked with documenting each new case, each development in what scholars were already calling the most significant mass affliction since the Children's Crusade. His training in both theology and natural philosophy positioned him uniquely to observe without predetermined judgment, and to record without the filter of established doctrine. What he witnessed defied every category of human experience. The dancers, for lack of a better term, showed no signs of coordination, yet moved in patterns that occasionally synchronized. They ate when food was placed in their mouths, but seemed incapable of stopping to seek nourishment independently. Most unsettling, they appeared to find genuine joy in their condition, laughing and singing between bouts of exhaustion that would have felled any normal person. As his quill scratched across the parchment that would become one of history's most important primary sources, Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that he documented not merely an outbreak of collective madness, but something far more profound. The dancers moved as if responding to music only they could hear, as if their bodies had become instruments in some cosmic composition whose meaning remained tantalizingly beyond comprehension. The mystery had only begun to unfold. Within a week, the dancing had claimed 34 souls. Brother Matthias walked the streets each dawn, counting the swaying figures, noting the peculiar evolution of their movements. What had begun as individual expressions of inexplicable compulsion was developing into something resembling choreographed chaos. The city's response revealed the deep fractures in medieval understanding of human nature. Physicians clung to Galenic theories of humoral imbalance, prescribing bloodletting and purges that proved utterly ineffective. The clergy proclaimed the dancing a divine punishment for the city's moral failings, pointing to everything from excessive merchant profits to the popularity of secular music. Yet neither medical intervention nor spiritual remedies showed any impact on the spreading affliction. Most intriguing to Matthias was the pattern of contagion. The dance didn't spread through physical contact or proximity, as plagues typically did. Instead, it seemed to select its victims according to some hidden logic. Agnes Müller, a wealthy merchant's wife known for her charity work, began dancing while distributing bread to the poor, but her servants, who had closer contact with the afflicted, remained unaffected. Meanwhile, Klaus Weber, a solitary cobbler who rarely ventured from his workshop, suddenly appeared in the main square, his leather apron flying as he performed leaps that would have impressed the finest court entertainers. The dancers themselves provided few clues. During their brief moments of rest, never more than an hour and often far less, they spoke of dreams filled with music, of voices calling them to move, of an overwhelming sense that their dancing served some essential purpose they couldn't articulate. Frau Trophea, now entering her second week of continuous movement, claimed she could see patterns in the air itself, geometric shapes that guided her steps. "It's not madness," she insisted to Dr. Bock during one of his increasingly frequent examinations. "It's remembering. My body remembers something my mind forgot." The physician noted this comment in his records, along with his observation that the dancers showed remarkable physical resilience. Despite consuming minimal food and water, Despite dancing through the heat of July days and the cool of summer nights, none showed signs of the exhaustion that should have killed them days ago. Their feet, which should have been bloodied stumps, remained intact. Their hearts, which should have burst from the exertion, beat with steady rhythm. Local authorities faced an impossible situation. The dancing disrupted commerce, frightened visitors, and challenged the social order. Yet the dancers committed no crime beyond the violation of public decorum. They harmed no one, stole nothing, preached no heresy. How do you arrest someone whose only offence is an inability to stand still? The guildmasters demanded action. The bakers complained that the dancing crowds frightened customers. The weavers reported decreased productivity as workers abandoned their looms to watch the spectacle. The church worried about declining attendance at services, though ironically many citizens spent more time in prayer, begging God to spare them from joining the dance. Young Elizabeth Zimmern's case particularly troubled Matthias. The girl came from a respectable family, had shown no signs of mental instability, and had been betrothed to a goldsmith's son just weeks before her affliction began. Yet when her parents and fiancé pleaded with her to stop, she could only weep while her body continued its measured movements. "I want to stop," she sobbed. "But the music, can't you hear it? It's so beautiful, and it says I must dance until something happens. Something important." The goldsmith's son, Johann, maintained a vigil beside her, bringing water and food, wiping her tears, even attempting to hold her still through sheer physical force. Nothing worked. Eventually he began moving to her rhythm, swaying slightly as he sat beside her. Matthias watched this development with growing alarm, wondering if Johann might become the next victim. Dr. Bock proposed an experiment. If the dancing represented some form of musical enchantment, perhaps counter-music might provide relief. He hired the city's best musicians to play calming melodies near the dancers, hoping to break whatever spell held them. The result was catastrophic. The moment the first note sounded, every dancer stopped. For 30 heartbeats, silence filled the square. Then, as if responding to some unheard conductor's baton, they began dancing with renewed vigour, their movements now synchronized to the musicians' playing. The music seemed to feed the affliction rather than cure it. That night, 3 musicians joined the dancers. Dr. Hieronymus Bock had studied at the finest universities in Europe. He had treated plague victims in Vienna, examined cases of ergotism in Bavaria, and corresponded with physicians from Paris to Prague. Yet the dancing plague challenged every principle of medical knowledge he had accumulated over 30 years of practice. His detailed observations, preserved in the monastery archives, provide the most systematic analysis of the phenomenon. The dancers showed no fever, no delirium, and no physical abnormalities beyond their compulsive movement. Their pulse rates, while elevated during active dancing, remained within survivable ranges. Most puzzling is that their bodies adapted to the continuous exertion in ways that defied physiological understanding. "The human form is not designed for such prolonged activity," he wrote to his former professor at the University of Basel. Yet these individuals show no signs of the muscle deterioration, dehydration, or cardiac distress that should accompany such exertion. It is as if their bodies have entered some altered state that suspends normal biological limitations. Bock's attempts at treatment revealed the inadequacy of contemporary medical theory. Bloodletting, the universal remedy for humoral imbalance, produced no change in the dancer's condition. Purges and emetics failed to expel whatever poison might have caused the affliction. Even trepanation, performed on one willing volunteer, merely added a head wound to his list of ailments without diminishing his need to dance. The physician began to suspect that the dancing plague represented something entirely outside the realm of traditional medicine. His correspondence with Brother Matthias reveals a growing fascination with the metaphysical implications of the outbreak. What if this condition originates not in the body but in some faculty of the soul we do not yet understand, he speculated. The dancers speak consistently of hearing music, of seeing patterns, of following instructions that come from within rather than without. Perhaps we witness not disease but revelation. This theory gained support from an unexpected source. Rabbi Mordecai ben Avraham, Strasbourg's most learned Jewish scholar, approached Bock with references from ancient texts describing similar phenomena. The Talmud mentioned cases of compulsive dancing associated with divine visions. Kabbalistic texts describe states of spiritual ecstasy that manifested through involuntary movement. Islamic scholars in nearby territories reported historical accounts of Sufi mystics whose dancing induced transcendent experiences. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested, these people have stumbled into a state of consciousness that mystics spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Bock found this perspective intriguing but problematic. The dancers showed none of the traditional signs of mystical experience. They reported no visions of divine beings, no prophecies, no unusual wisdom or insight. Instead, they seemed trapped in a state that brought neither spiritual enlightenment nor physical relief. The physician's most significant breakthrough came through careful observation of the dancers' interactions with each other. Despite the apparent randomness of their movements, patterns emerged. Dancers who had been strangers before their affliction began to move in complementary rhythms. Their individual dances gradually synchronized, creating complex group choreographies that seemed to serve some unifying purpose. Margaret Lohner, a widow who had joined the dancers in the third week, provided crucial testimony during one of her brief rest periods. "We are pieces of something larger," she gasped. "Each dance is a part, but we cannot see the whole. Only when we all move together does the true pattern emerge." Bock began mapping the dancers' positions and movements, creating diagrams that revealed an underlying geometry to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled mathematical principles he had encountered in architectural texts. Golden ratios, spiral sequences, harmonic proportions that appeared throughout nature. This discovery led to a disturbing realization. If the dancing followed mathematical laws, it might not be random affliction but rather the manifestation of some deeper order. The dancers might be unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract principles, their bodies serving as instruments in a vast calculation whose purpose remained hidden. The implications terrified both physician and scholar. If human beings could be compelled to serve as components in some larger system without their conscious awareness, what did this suggest about free will, about the nature of individual identity, about humanity's place in the cosmic order? As July drew to a close with over 60 dancers now active in Strasbourg's streets, Bock abandoned his attempts at medical treatment. Instead, he focused on documentation, convinced that he witnessed not disease but discovery, the unveiling of some fundamental aspect of human nature that had remained hidden until this extraordinary moment. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and the implications grew more unsettling with each passing day. The ecclesiastical response to the dancing plague exposed deep theological tensions within the church. Brother Matthias found himself at the centre of heated debates between different factions of clergy, each proposing radically different interpretations of the unprecedented phenomenon. Bishop Johann Weidmann initially declared the dancing a manifestation of demonic possession, ordering exorcisms and public prayers for the afflicted. Yet, when Father Wilhelm, one of the diocese's most respected priests, joined the dancers, this explanation became untenable. How could a man who had spent decades fighting evil suddenly succumb to it? The dancing father continued to recite prayers and bless those who approached him, even as his body swayed in patterns that seemed to mock ecclesiastical dignity. Prior Benedict, head of Matthias's monastery, proposed an alternative theory rooted in mystical tradition. "Perhaps God tests our understanding," he suggested during a chapter meeting. "Scripture tells us David danced before the Lord with all his might. The prophets often receive divine communication through ecstatic states. What if these dancers have been chosen to receive revelation in a form we do not yet comprehend?" An unexpected source of support for this perspective emerged. Sister Johanna of the nearby convent of St. Agnes reported that several nuns had experienced powerful spiritual visions while observing the dancers. During their regular hours of prayer, they found themselves moving in subtle rhythms that seemed to echo the dancers' movements. Most significantly, they reported an enhanced sense of divine presence during these experiences. "When I allow my body to respond to the rhythm I perceive in their dancing," Sister Johanna testified, "my prayers become more profound. my connection to the Creator more immediate. It is as if their movements create a bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. Yet this mystical interpretation faced strong opposition from the Dominican friars, who saw in the dancing a dangerous form of enthusiasm that threatened church authority. Brother Heinrich, their most vocal spokesman, argued that any spiritual experience not mediated through established religious channels must be viewed with extreme suspicion. These dancers claimed to receive instruction directly from some divine or cosmic source, he declared during a public sermon. They circumvent the sacraments, disregard clerical guidance, and adhere to impulses that might stem from the depths of hell. If we accept their claims, we undermine the very foundation of Christian order. The theological debate intensified when several dancers began incorporating religious gestures into their movements. They crossed themselves while spinning, genuflected during leaps, and raised their arms in positions reminiscent of crucifixion. Yet these sacred elements appeared seamlessly woven into dance patterns that retained their essentially secular character. Matthias observed these developments with growing fascination. The dancers seemed to access some form of religious expression that transcended traditional categories. Their movement prayers appeared simultaneously more primitive and more sophisticated than conventional worship, as if they had discovered a method of spiritual communication that predated organized religion yet pointed towards some more evolved form of divine encounter. The situation became even more complex when Rabbi Mordecai reported similar theological discussions within the Jewish community. Several respected Torah scholars had begun incorporating swaying movements into their study sessions, claiming that physical rhythm enhanced their ability to penetrate sacred texts. The Kabbalistic tradition of meditative movement suddenly seemed directly relevant to current events. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested to Matthias during one of their regular conversations, we witness the emergence of a universal spiritual language that transcends the boundaries between our different faiths. The dancers may be unconsciously recovering ancient forms of worship that were practiced before religious traditions became institutionalized. This possibility alarmed both Christian and Jewish authorities. If the dancing represented some primordial form of spiritual expression, it potentially challenged the legitimacy of all established religious institutions. The dancers' apparent ability to access transcendent experiences without priestly mediation suggested that formal religious structures might be unnecessary, or even obstacles to genuine spiritual encounter. The controversy reached a crescendo when young Elisabeth Zimmern began speaking in what appeared to be unknown languages during her dance. Linguistic scholars determined that her utterances followed consistent grammatical patterns that corresponded to no known human tongue. Church authorities faced the uncomfortable possibility that she spoke in the tongues of angels mentioned in Scripture, yet outside any recognized ecclesiastical context. Bishop Weidmann found himself in an impossible position. He could not condemn phenomena that might represent genuine divine communication, yet he could not endorse activities that undermined church authority. His compromise solution satisfied no one. He declared the dancing neither inherently sacred nor profane, but rather a mysterious manifestation that required careful study before any definitive theological judgment could be made. This official position of studied neutrality reflected the broader uncertainty that gripped all of Strasbourg's intellectual and spiritual leaders. The dancing plague had revealed the inadequacy of every existing framework for understanding human behavior and divine interaction. As July turned to August, with the number of dancers approaching 100, it became clear that the phenomenon would not be easily contained within familiar categories of explanation. The sacred and profane were merging in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval worldview, and no one could predict where this unprecedented fusion might lead. The Strasbourg City Council faced an administrative nightmare without precedent in municipal law. How do you govern a population increasingly composed of individuals who cannot control their own movements? By early August 1518, nearly 100 citizens danced continuously through the streets, creating chaos that threatened the city's economic and social stability. Magistrate Conrad Wickram, elected to office based on his reputation for practical problem-solving, found every conventional solution ineffective. His first approach had been straightforward law enforcement, arrest the dancers for disturbing the peace. However, the city jail could not accommodate 100 prisoners, especially prisoners who required constant supervision and continued to dance within their cells. Moreover, the legal precedent was unclear. Medieval law addressed theft, assault, heresy, and various forms of misconduct, but nowhere in legal tradition could the magistrates find guidance for dealing with compulsive dancing. The guild masters presented increasingly desperate petitions. The bakers reported significant losses as crowds of spectators made normal business impossible. The cloth merchants complained that trade delegations from other cities were avoiding Strasbourg, fearing contamination by whatever affliction caused the dancing. Most seriously, agricultural workers from surrounding villages were abandoning their harvest duties, drawn to the city by reports of the miraculous dancing. If this continues through harvest season, warned Johann Zeckler, master of the Farmers' Guild, we face not merely economic disruption but potential famine. The dancers consume resources while producing nothing. Worse, they inspire others to abandon productive labour in favour of gawking at this spectacle. Wickram's attempts at practical solutions revealed the phenomenon's resistance to conventional intervention. He hired additional musicians, reasoning that if dancing was inevitable, perhaps organised music might channel it in less disruptive directions. This backfired spectacularly when the musicians themselves became infected and joined the ranks of the uncontrollably dancing. The magistrate then attempted to confine the dancers to a specific area outside the city walls, hoping to minimise their impact on daily commerce. However, the dancers showed no awareness of artificial boundaries. They moved according to internal imperatives that paid no attention to human attempts at crowd control. Guards assigned to maintain containment found themselves gradually swaying to the rhythm of the dancers' movements, requiring frequent rotation to prevent further infections. Legal scholars consulted ancient Roman law, canon law, and traditional Germanic customs, finding no precedent for the current situation. The dancers committed no crime, yet violated social order. They harmed no one, yet endangered public welfare. They followed no leader, yet moved with apparent coordination. Every category of legal classification proved inadequate. Dr. Bock's medical reports complicated attempts at legal resolution. His documentation demonstrated that the dancers suffered from no disease that legal authorities could reasonably quarantine. They showed no signs of madness that would justify confinement to asylums. Most problematically, they retained enough mental capacity to make their own decisions about most matters. They simply could not control their compulsive movement. The situation deteriorated when several city council members began showing signs of rhythmic susceptibility. Observers noticed Councilman Peter Imlin swaying during official meetings, his foot tapping in patterns that appeared to mimic the dancers' rhythms. Rather than acknowledge this development, the council implemented new procedures requiring all members to remain seated and still during deliberations, with guards instructed to intervene if anyone showed signs of unusual movement. Economic pressure mounted as trade relationships suffered. Merchants from Basel and Frankfurt reported to their city councils that Strasbourg had become a city possessed, discouraging commercial interaction until the crisis resolved. The annual harvest fair, crucial to the region's economy, faced potential cancellation as participating merchants expressed reluctance to enter a city where they might become infected with uncontrollable dancing. Wickram's most creative solution involved attempting to negotiate directly with the dancers. Perhaps reasoning could succeed where force had failed. He organised formal meetings where city representatives attempted to discuss the situation with dancers during their brief rest periods. These conversations proved profoundly unsettling. The dancers consistently expressed their desire to stop, their awareness of the disruption they caused, and their complete inability to control their condition. Yet they also described their dancing as serving some essential purpose that they could not fully articulate. They spoke of participating in something larger than themselves, of their movements contributing to some vast pattern whose completion remained necessary. "Stop, you say, but we can't stop any more than you can stop your heart," said Frau Trofea. "This dancing is not our choice. It is our function. When the pattern is complete, we will rest. Until then, we must continue." When pressed to explain what pattern they meant, the dancers could offer only vague descriptions of geometric shapes, musical harmonies, and mathematical relationships that their bodies somehow expressed through movement. Their testimony suggested they served as unwilling participants in some cosmic calculation whose nature remained beyond human comprehension. The council's final attempt at resolution involved consulting authorities from other cities that had experienced similar phenomena. Historical research uncovered scattered reports of dancing outbreaks across European history, yet no detailed documentation was available to offer valuable guidance. Moreover, previous episodes had apparently resolved spontaneously, offering little insight into effective intervention strategies. By late August, Magistrate Wickham privately admitted defeat. The city government could neither stop the dancing nor effectively manage its consequences. They could only hope the phenomenon would end as mysteriously as it began, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. The authorities' inability to address the crisis reflected a deeper failure of medieval institutions to comprehend emerging realities that transcended traditional categories of understanding. September brought an unexpected development that changed everything Brother Matthias thought he understood about the dancing plague. The revelation came not through scholarly analysis or medical examination, but through the observations of an unlikely witness, Master Johann Gutenberg, a visiting printer investigating Strasbourg's potential as a location for his revolutionary, movable-type workshop. Gutenberg possessed a unique perspective, shaped by his work with mechanical systems, mathematical precision, and pattern recognition essential to printing technology. While other observers focused on individual dancers or small groups, he studied the overall configuration of all dancers throughout the city. His trained eye, accustomed to detecting subtle alignments and spacing relationships, perceived something that had eluded everyone else. "They are not dancing randomly," he told Matthias during an evening meeting at the monastery. "From an elevated position, I observed from the cathedral tower, their movements create a vast geometric pattern that spans the entire city. Individual dancers serve as moving points in a complex diagram that appears to be nearing completion." Matthias initially dismissed this theory as fanciful speculation. However, Gutenberg's systematic documentation proved compelling. He had mapped the positions of all known dancers at regular intervals, creating a series of diagrams that revealed an underlying order to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled nothing in conventional human experience. They incorporated elements of sacred geometry, musical harmony, and mathematical principles that seemed almost too sophisticated for the medieval understanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The dancers were unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract concepts that challenged the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. "Look at these measurements," Gutenberg explained, spreading his carefully drafted diagrams across the monastery table. The distances between dancers, the timing of their movements, the directions of their travel, everything follows precise mathematical relationships. They are drawing something in space and time, using their bodies as instruments in a calculation beyond human design. This discovery raised terrifying questions. If the dancers unconsciously followed mathematical laws, who or what had programmed these laws? The patterns were too complex, too purposeful to be accidental, yet they were also too alien to be products of human intelligence. The dancers themselves remained unaware of the larger design they were creating, responding to impulses they could not explain or control. Brother Matthias pondered the implications during sleepless nights. Were the dancers unwilling participants in some cosmic experiment? Had some intelligence, divine, demonic, or entirely other, selected Strasbourg as the site for a demonstration whose purpose remained hidden? The possibility that human beings could be manipulated like pieces on a chessboard challenged fundamental beliefs about free will and human dignity. Dr. Bock's medical observations supported Gutenberg's geometric analysis. The physician had noted that individual dancers' movements became increasingly precise over time, as if they were gradually learning to perform their roles more accurately. Their apparent fatigue seemed to diminish rather than increase, suggesting that their bodies were adapting to serve the requirements of the larger pattern. "They are becoming more efficient," Bock reported. "Their movements consume less energy while achieving greater precision." It is as if some process is optimizing their performance to serve functions we do not yet understand. The most unsettling aspect of Gutenberg's discovery was its progressive nature. The pattern was not static, but evolving, approaching some form of completion that might trigger unknown consequences. Based on the rate of change he had documented, the printer estimated that the geometric design would reach its final configuration within days. What happens when the pattern is complete? Matthias asked, though he feared the answer. Gutenberg could only speculate. Perhaps the dancers would finally be released from their compulsion. Perhaps the completion would trigger some larger event that the dancing had been designed to facilitate. Or perhaps the entire phenomenon would simply end, leaving behind only the memory of humanity's brief role as unwilling participants in some incomprehensible cosmic process. The printer's analysis also revealed why certain individuals were selected to become dancers, while others remained unaffected. The pattern required specific positions to be filled by dancers with particular physical characteristics, movement capabilities, and spatial relationships to other participants. The selection process had nothing to do with spiritual worthiness, moral character, or personal vulnerability. It was purely functional, based on requirements that remained hidden from human understanding. This mechanical view of the dancing plague stripped away all romantic or mystical interpretations. The dancers were not blessed visionaries or cursed victims. They were simply tools being used by some intelligence to create something beyond human comprehension. Their suffering, their loss of autonomy, their disruption of normal life served as acceptable costs in pursuing some larger objective. As September progressed, Gutenberg's predictions proved accurate. The dancers' movements became increasingly synchronized, their individual variations gradually harmonizing into a unified whole. The geometric pattern approached completion with mathematical inevitability, regardless of human attempts to understand or intervene. The residents of Strasbourg could only wait and wonder what would happen when the mysterious calculation finally reached its conclusion. The pattern that had claimed so many of their neighbours was nearly complete, and none could predict whether its fulfilment would bring liberation or catastrophe. October 15th, 1518. Brother Matthias recorded the date with a trembling hand, knowing he documented either the end of the most mysterious chapter in Strasbourg's history, or merely its transformation into something even more incomprehensible. The dancing plague, which had held the city captive for over 3 months, reached its conclusion in a manner that satisfied no theory and answered no questions. The end came with mathematical precision that confirmed Gutenberg's geometric analysis, while revealing its ultimate inadequacy. At exactly noon, when the cathedral bells announced the 6th hour, every dancer throughout the city stopped simultaneously. The dancers stopped not gradually, not individually, but in perfect unison, as if some cosmic conductor had finally lowered his baton. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the months of continuous movement had been. 137 people stood motionless in streets, squares and courtyards throughout Strasbourg, their faces bearing expressions of profound confusion and loss. They looked around like dreamers awakening in unfamiliar surroundings, unable to reconcile their present situation with their last clear memories. Dr. Bock rushed to examine the former dancers, expecting to find signs of exhaustion, malnutrition or physical damage from their prolonged ordeal. Instead, he discovered individuals in remarkably good health. Better health, in many cases, than they had enjoyed before their dancing began. Chronic ailments had disappeared, old injuries had healed, even elderly dancers showed renewed vitality that seemed to reverse months or years of aging. It is as if the dancing purified their bodies while enslaving their wills, Bock reported to the emergency council session convened that afternoon. They have been transformed by their experience in ways that challenge every principle of natural philosophy. Yet the physical improvements came with a price that became apparent only gradually. The former dancers retained no detailed memories of their time in the grip of the compulsion. They remembered beginning to dance, and they remembered the moment of release, but the months between remained largely blank, as if their consciousness had been suspended, while their bodies served purposes beyond their understanding. Worrisomely, they reported enduring sensations, implying that their experience had not fully concluded. They felt perpetual awareness of subtle rhythms, faint melodies that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Some claimed they could still perceive the geometric patterns that had guided their movements, now visible as translucent overlays on the normal world. "The dancing has ended," Frau Troffea told Matthias during her first coherent interview, "but something remains. I feel expectant, as if we completed only the first movement of a longer composition." Elisabeth Simmons' testimony proved particularly unsettling. The young woman, whose graceful movements had captivated observers throughout the crisis, now possessed enhanced sensitivity to patterns and relationships that others could not perceive. She could predict weather changes days in advance, sense emotional states in people she had never met, and identify mathematical relationships in natural phenomena with uncanny accuracy. "The dancing taught us something," she explained, "not in words or thoughts, but in our bones, our blood, our deepest being. We learned a language that has no sounds, only movement and relationship and truth." Gutenberg's geometric analysis provided the only framework for understanding what had occurred. His final diagrams showed that the pattern created by the dancers' movements had indeed reached completion on October 15th. Yet completion had not resulted in dissolution, but rather in transformation. The physical dancing had ended, but it had apparently established something permanent, a new configuration of relationships that continued to influence the former dancers and, increasingly, the city itself. Over the following weeks, Strasbourg experienced subtle but significant changes. Trade negotiations proceeded more smoothly, as if commercial relationships had been somehow optimized. Conflicts between guildmasters resolved more easily. Even the weather seemed more favorable, with gentle rains arriving precisely when crops required moisture. Citizens began reporting unusually vivid dreams, enhanced creativity, and improved ability to understand complex problems. It was as if the completed geometric pattern had created some form of beneficial resonance that enhanced human capabilities throughout the region. Yet these improvements carried an undercurrent of unease. If unknown intelligences could manipulate human beings to create patterns that then influenced entire communities, what did such behaviour suggest about human autonomy? Were the residents of Strasbourg now subject to guidance they could neither perceive nor resist? Brother Matthias completed his chronicle with more questions than answers. The dancing plague had ended, but its resolution raised more disturbing possibilities than its occurrence had. The dancers had been released from their compulsion, but they remained connected to whatever intelligence had choreographed their movements. The transformation of Strasbourg was complete, yet its nature and purpose remained a mystery. Most troubling of all, reports began arriving from other cities throughout the German states, describing unusual group behaviours, synchronized activities, and collective movements that seemed to echo Strasbourg's experience. Perhaps the dancing plague had not ended, but merely completed its initial phase, preparing for expansion into something far more comprehensive. As winter approached, Matthias sealed his manuscript in the monastery archives, hoping that future scholars might possess the knowledge necessary to understand what he had witnessed. The mystery of the dancing plague would endure long beyond the lives of those who experienced it, a testament to humanity's encounter with forces that operated according to laws not yet discovered and purposes not yet revealed. The dance had ended, but the music played on, silent, invisible, and eternally transformative. Picture this. It's 1955 and you're walking through Indianapolis on a Sunday morning. The air smells like coffee and car exhaust, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the familiar sound of church bells. But if you follow a different sound, the one that's part revival meeting, part theatre performance, you'll find yourself outside a modest building where something unusual is happening. Inside, a young man, adorned with slicked back hair and thick glasses, is performing an act that would cause your grandmother to tremble. He's preaching to a congregation that looks like a rainbow, black folks and white folks, all sitting together like it's the most natural thing in the world. In 1955, Indianapolis, This event was about as radical as announcing you'd discovered life on Mars. Even then, it was evident that Jim Jones was not your typical preacher. He had this way of speaking that made people lean forward in their seats, like he was sharing secrets from the universe itself. When he talked about building a better world, his voice carried the kind of conviction that made you want to believe him, even if you weren't sure what exactly you were believing in. You see, Jones had figured out something that politicians and snake oil salesmen have known for centuries. People are hungry for belonging. Not just the casual, "Hey, how's your weekend?" kind of belonging, but the deep soul-level kind that makes you feel like you've finally found your tribe. In the 1950s, America, the hunger for belonging was particularly acute due to its rigid social rules and invisible but very real barriers. Jones called his church the People's Temple, which sounds innocent enough until you realise he chose that name very deliberately. Not God's temple or Christ's temple, but People's Temple. He was positioning himself as the pastor of humanity itself, though at the time it probably just sounded progressive and inclusive. The man had a gift for reading people like they were open books. He'd spot the lonely widow in the third row, the young couple struggling to make ends meet, and the teenager who felt like an outsider everywhere else, and somehow he'd make each of them feel like they were the most important person in the room. It was like watching a master chef work. You couldn't quite see all the ingredients going into the dish, but the result was undeniably appealing. What made Jones particularly dangerous wasn't that he was obviously evil. Those types are easy to spot coming. It was that he genuinely seemed to care about social justice. He was advocating for racial equality decades before it was fashionable, running soup kitchens and taking in foster children. If you were keeping score of good deeds versus red flags in those early days, the good deeds were winning by a landslide. But here's the thing about charismatic leaders. They're like those Russian nesting dolls. You think you know who they are, but then you find another version inside and another inside that. Jones, the civil rights advocate, contained Jones, the control enthusiast. Jones, the megalomaniac, contained something much darker that wouldn't fully emerge until much later. In the early 1960s, Jones relocated his operations to California, deciding that it would be more advantageous to establish a utopian community in a state with favourable weather conditions. He set up shop in Redwood Valley, a small town in Northern California that was about as far from the urban chaos of the era as you could get, without actually leaving civilization. The temple was growing, and with it Jones's ambitions. He wasn't content to just run a church anymore. He wanted to create a whole new way of living. He started talking about apostolic socialism, which was basically Christianity mixed with communist ideals, seasoned with a healthy dose of Jim Jones worship. It seemed as though someone had blended traditional religion, political revolution, and a personality cult to the utmost degree. And people were buying it. Hundreds of people, not just a handful, were embracing it. They were selling their houses, quitting their jobs, and moving to be closer to the temple. They were turning over their social security checks, their savings accounts, and their trust funds. They were signing custody of their children over to Jones. You might be wondering how intelligent, capable adults could make such drastic decisions. But that's the thing about gradual persuasion. It's like gaining weight. You don't notice it happening until one day you realise your pants don't fit anymore. Imagine you're feeling lost in your life. Maybe you're recently divorced, or you've just lost a job, or you're dealing with the kind of depression that makes getting out of bed feel like climbing Everest. Then someone comes along who not only understands your pain, but also offers you a purpose, a family, and a chance to change the world. Delivered by someone who seems to have all the answers, that's a pretty compelling sales pitch. Jones had mastered a technique that psychologists now refer to as love bombing, but back then, people simply referred to it as incredibly welcoming. New members were showered with attention, given important-sounding roles, and made to feel like they were part of something historic. It was like being invited to the coolest party in town, except the party never ended, and gradually you realised you weren't allowed to leave. The temple's daily routine was designed to keep people busy and connected. There were meetings every night, work projects during the day, and social activities that filled up any remaining free time. It was like being at summer camp, if summer camp lasted forever, and the counsellors gradually took over every aspect of your life. Jones was particularly skilled at creating artificial urgency. He'd receive visions about impending nuclear war, or he'd discover plots by government agencies to destroy the temple. These crises always seemed to require immediate action. usually involving more commitment, more donations, or more isolation from the outside world. It was like watching someone play a video game where the difficulty level kept increasing, except the players didn't realise they were playing a game. The social dynamics within the temple were fascinating in a disturbing way. Jones had created a system where loyalty to him was rewarded with status and privilege, while questioning anything was treated as a character flaw that needed to be corrected. Public confession sessions became a regular feature, where members would admit to thoughts or behaviours that showed insufficient devotion to the cause. It was akin to group therapy, but instead of promoting healing, it systematically undermined individuals. What's particularly chilling is how Jones used genuine social problems to justify increasingly extreme measures. He'd point to racism, poverty and violence in the outside world as evidence that the temple was the only safe space for his followers. Every news story about social unrest became proof that he was right about the need for radical change. It was like he was using the world's problems as marketing material for his cult. By the mid-1970s, Jones had perfected what he called revolutionary suicide, the idea that dying for the cause was more noble than living in a corrupt world. He'd have members drink what they thought was poison in fake drills to test their commitment. It was like fire drills, except instead of preparing for an emergency, they were rehearsing for mass suicide. The temple's financial operations were equally sophisticated. Jones had convinced hundreds of people to sign over their social security checks, their pensions, and their property deeds. The organisation was pulling in millions of dollars annually, which gave Jones enormous power and influence. He used this money to buy politicians, silence critics, and create an image of the temple as a legitimate social justice organisation. Meanwhile, Jones himself was becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. He was addicted to prescription drugs, sleeping very little, and becoming convinced that government agents were infiltrating his organisation. But instead of seeking help, he used his paranoia to justify even more extreme control over his followers. It was like watching someone's mental health deteriorate in real time, except hundreds of people were dependent on him for their sense of reality. The most tragic part was how Jones had convinced his followers that their love for him was actually love for humanity. He'd created a system where caring about your own family, your own needs, or your own future was seen as selfish. The only acceptable form of love was devotion to the cause, which meant devotion to Jim Jones. It was emotional manipulation disguised as spiritual enlightenment. By 1977, Jones was facing increasing scrutiny from former members, investigative journalists and government agencies. His response wasn't to address the legitimate concerns being raised, but to plan an escape. He'd been working on an agricultural project in Guyana, a remote South American country. He called it Jonestown, because apparently modesty wasn't one of his virtues. Temple members presented the move to Guyana as the ultimate expression of their commitment to building a better world. They were going to create a socialist paradise in the jungle, free from the racism and oppression of American society. It sounded like an adventure, a chance to be pioneers in a new kind of community. What Jones didn't mention was that once his followers got to Guyana, they'd be trapped in one of the most isolated places on Earth, completely dependent on him for survival, with no way to leave even if they wanted to. The agricultural project was really a prison, and the paradise was about to become a nightmare. You know how sometimes you book a vacation based on pictures that turn out to be misleading? Well, imagine if instead of a disappointing hotel room, you ended up in a jungle clearing with basic wooden buildings, no electricity, and the nearest neighbour about 1 million miles away. That's essentially what happened to the nearly 1,000 people who moved to Jonestown between 1977 and 1978. Jones had been working on this Guyana project for years, selling it to his followers as their chance to build a socialist utopia away from the racial tensions and political problems of America. The brochures, and yes, there were actually brochures, showed smiling people working in lush gardens, children playing happily, and everyone living in harmony with nature. The project appeared to be a hybrid of a farming commune and a tropical resort. The reality was more akin to a hybrid of a prison camp and a survival show. The buildings were basic wooden structures that let in every bug, snake and tropical disease the jungle had to offer. The promised agricultural paradise was mostly cleared land where crops struggled to grow in soil that hadn't been properly prepared. The medical facilities consisted of a small clinic that was better equipped for treating homesickness than tropical diseases. But here's the thing about being trapped in an isolated location with a charismatic leader. You start to normalise things that would have seemed completely insane back home. When Jones announced that everyone would work 12-hour days in the fields, everyone was presented as contributing to the collective good. His mandatory evening meetings, which lasted until midnight, were dubbed revolutionary education. When he started controlling who could talk to whom, it was described as maintaining unity and focus. The daily routine at Jonestown was designed to keep people exhausted and dependent. You'd wake up at 6 a.m. to the sound of Jones's voice over the loudspeaker system. Yes, there were speakers throughout the camp broadcasting his messages constantly. After a quick breakfast of rice and beans, the menu didn't vary much, you'd head to the fields for manual labour that would make a prison work detail look like a leisurely stroll. Jones had figured out that physical exhaustion was one of the most effective forms of mind control. When people are tired, hungry and overwhelmed, they don't have the mental energy to question authority or think critically about their situation. It's like trying to solve complex math problems after running a marathon. Your brain just doesn't have the resources to function properly. The social dynamics in Jonestown were even more controlling than they had been back in California. Jones had informants throughout the community who reported on anyone who expressed doubts or complained about conditions. Private conversations were discouraged, and anyone caught spreading negativity would be subjected to public criticism sessions that could last for hours. It was like living in a fishbowl, except the fish were being constantly watched by other fish, who might turn them into the head fish. What made the situation particularly tragic was how Jones used people's genuine desire to help others as a weapon against them. He'd convince parents that their children would be better off in the communal nursery, then use the children as leverage to keep the parents in line. He'd tell people that their elderly relatives needed special care, then isolate those relatives so they couldn't share their concerns with family members. The medical situation at Jonestown was particularly disturbing. Jones was consuming massive quantities of prescription drugs, stimulants to keep him awake, sedatives to help him sleep, and various other medications to manage his increasingly erratic behaviour. But instead of getting proper treatment, he was being enabled by a small circle of loyalists who had convinced themselves that his drug use was somehow necessary for his leadership abilities. Meanwhile, the general population was dealing with tropical diseases, malnutrition, and injuries from the manual labour, all while being told that complaining about their health was a sign of weakness or disloyalty. The medical staff was overwhelmed and under-equipped, trying to treat serious conditions with basic supplies, and no way to evacuate patients who needed more advanced care. Jones had also instituted what he called extended family relationships, which was really a system of arranged partnerships designed to break down traditional family bonds and increase loyalty to him. People were encouraged to report on their family members if they showed signs of disloyalty, and children were taught to see Jones as their primary parent figure. It was like he was systematically dismantling every relationship that might compete with his authority. The communication with the outside world was completely controlled by Jones and his inner circle. Jones and his inner circle censored letters home, monitored phone calls and carefully managed visitors. Family members back in the United States were told that their loved ones were too busy building the new community to write often, and that they were happier than they'd ever been. It was like an entire community had been kidnapped, but the kidnappers were sending cheerful postcards to prevent anyone from noticing. By early 1978, some people were starting to realise that they'd made a terrible mistake. But leaving Jonestown wasn't as simple as buying a plane ticket. The nearest airport was hours away through jungle terrain, and Jones had convinced the Guyanese government that he was running a legitimate agricultural project that deserved protection. Anyone who tried to leave was told they were abandoning their commitment to social justice and betraying their fellow community members. The few individuals who succeeded in escaping recounted tales that appeared almost unreal. They recounted tales of armed guards, food shortages, and a leader who was evidently losing his sense of reality. However, many dismissed their accounts as the complaints of individuals unable to cope with the challenges of establishing a new society. Jones, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly paranoid about outside interference. He was convinced that government agents were planning to destroy Jonestown, and he began preparing his followers for what he called revolutionary suicide, the idea that dying for the cause was preferable to being captured or destroyed by enemies. It was like he was writing the script for a tragedy, and casting his followers as the unwilling actors. You know that feeling when you're in a relationship that's gone bad, but you've invested so much time and energy that leaving feels impossible? Imagine a scenario where not only your romantic life is at risk, but also your entire sense of identity, your family, your future, and potentially your entire life. That's what it was like for the people trapped in Jonestown as 1978 wore on. By this point, Jones wasn't even pretending to be a legitimate religious leader anymore. He'd started referring to himself as God, holding bizarre ceremonies where followers were required to worship him directly. The man who had once preached about Christian love and social justice was now demanding that people bow down to him and confess their inadequacies in elaborate public rituals. It was like watching someone's ego inflate until it consumed everything around it. The daily routine had become a form of psychological torture disguised as community building. Jones would wake people up in the middle of the night for emergency meetings about imaginary threats. He'd force them to participate in revolutionary games that were really exercises in humiliation and control. He'd separate families, reassign living arrangements, and change work assignments seemingly at random, all while insisting that these changes were necessary for the greater good. What made the situation particularly cruel was how Jones used people's own values against them. He'd convince parents that true love meant allowing their children to be raised by the community rather than forming selfish attachments. He'd tell people that their desire to contact family members back home was evidence of bourgeois sentimentality that needed to be overcome. He'd frame every natural human instinct as a character flaw that required correction. The physical conditions at Jonestown were deteriorating rapidly. The agricultural project that was supposed to make the community self-sufficient was failing spectacularly. Crops were dying, equipment was breaking down, and the tropical climate was proving far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. People were losing weight, getting sick, and working themselves to exhaustion trying to meet impossible goals. Jones responded to these failures by blaming his followers for their lack of commitment. If the crops weren't growing, it was because people weren't working hard enough. If people were getting sick, it was because they were allowing negative thoughts to affect their health. If the community wasn't thriving, it was because individuals were being selfish instead of putting the collective good first. It was like watching someone set a house on fire and then blame it for burning. The psychological manipulation had reached levels that would have impressed totalitarian dictators. Jones had created a system where questioning anything was treated as a mental illness, where expressing doubts was considered evidence of moral weakness, and where the only acceptable emotion was gratitude for the privilege of being part of his revolutionary experiment. People were literally being programmed to doubt their perceptions and instincts. Meanwhile, back in the United States, family members were becoming increasingly concerned about their loved ones in Jonestown. They'd formed a group called the Concerned Relatives, led by a man named Leo Ryan, who happened to be a congressman from California. Ryan had been hearing disturbing stories from people who'd escaped from Jonestown, and he'd decided to investigate personally. Jones was terrified of outside scrutiny, and for good reason. The escapees' stories depicted a community that resembled a concentration camp rather than a utopian experiment. They talked about armed guards, food shortages, brutal punishment for minor infractions, and a leader who was clearly suffering from severe mental illness and drug addiction. The congressman's planned visit sent Jones into a panic. He knew that if Ryan actually saw the conditions at Jonestown, the whole operation would be exposed, but he also knew that preventing the visit would raise even more suspicions, so he decided to put on a show, cleaning up the camp, coaching his followers on what to say, and preparing for what he hoped would be a brief, superficial visit that would satisfy the congressman's curiosity. Jones underestimated the willingness of some of his followers to risk everything in order to escape. The congressional visit was the first real chance they'd had to get out. It was like prisoners planning a jailbreak, except the prison guards were people they'd once considered friends and family. The tension in Jonestown during the weeks leading up to Ryan's visit was almost unbearable. Jones alternated between manic optimism about deceiving the congressman and paranoid rage about exposure. His followers oscillated between the hope of imminent rescue and the fear of potential consequences if they attempted to flee. Jones had been conducting practice sessions for what he called revolutionary suicide for months, telling his followers that death was preferable to being captured by their enemies. He'd framed these rehearsals as tests of loyalty, but they were really psychological conditioning, preparing people for the unthinkable. It resembled a rehearsal for a tragedy that everyone hoped would never materialise. The community was living under constant surveillance, with Jones's most loyal followers watching for any signs of disloyalty or escape attempts. People had completely destroyed trust, fearing that their own family members might report anything they said to Jones. It was like living in a police state, except the police were your neighbours, and the dictator was someone you'd once loved and trusted. As November 1978 approached, everyone in Jonestown could feel that something was about to happen. Jones was becoming increasingly erratic, his speeches more paranoid and threatening. The armed guards were more visible, the rules more strict, and the punishments more severe. It was like watching a pressure cooker building toward an explosion, except no one knew exactly when or how it would happen. The people trapped in Jonestown were about to face the ultimate test of their survival instincts, and many of them had been so thoroughly manipulated that they no longer trusted their judgment about what survival even meant. November the 17th, 1978, started like any other day in Jonestown, which is to say it started with Jim Jones's voice crackling over the loudspeaker system at dawn, reminding everyone that they were part of something greater than themselves. But you could feel the tension in the air, thick as the jungle humidity. Today was different because today, Congressman Leo Ryan was coming to visit. Jones had been preparing for this moment for weeks, coaching his followers on what to say and how to act. The settlement had been cleaned up, most obviously sick people had been hidden away, and everyone had been reminded that the future of their revolutionary experiment depended on convincing Ryan that everything was wonderful. It was like preparing for the world's most important job interview, except the consequences of failure were unthinkable. When Ryan's small delegation arrived, accompanied by some journalists and a few relatives of Jonestown residents, Jones put on his most charming performance. He gave them a tour of the agricultural areas, showed them the communal dining hall, and presented Jonestown as a thriving example of racial harmony and collective living. To casual observers, it might have looked impressive, at least on the surface, but some of the residents were watching for their chance. A few brave souls had been planning for this moment, knowing it might be their only opportunity to escape. They were taking enormous risks. Jones had stressed that anyone who tried to leave would be considered a traitor to the cause, and traitors face severe consequences. It was like planning a jailbreak where the guards were your family members. The visit was supposed to be brief and ceremonial, but it quickly became clear that some people wanted out. A family named the Parks approached Ryan's delegation and quietly asked for help leaving. Then others began to step forward, despite the obvious terror in their eyes. It was like watching people finally find the courage to admit that their marriage was abusive, except the stakes were life and death. Jones tried to maintain his composure, but you could see the panic in his eyes. His carefully orchestrated performance was falling apart, and with it, his control over the situation. He started making increasingly desperate attempts to convince people to stay, alternating between pleading and veiled threats. It was like watching a skilled actor forget his lines in the middle of the most important performance of his career. As the day wore on, more people gathered the courage to approach Ryan's group. They were afraid, but they were more afraid of staying than of leaving. Some had family members who refused to go with them, creating heartbreaking scenes of families being torn apart by impossible choices. Others were prevented from leaving by armed guards who were still loyal to Jones. The situation reached a breaking point when Jones realised he couldn't control the narrative anymore. Too many people were asking to leave, and the journalists were asking too many difficult questions. The facade of the happy, voluntary community was crumbling, and Jones knew that once the truth got out, everything would be over. In the late afternoon, Ryan's delegation prepared to leave, taking with them about 20 people who had asked for help escaping. They headed to the small airstrip that served as Jonestown's connection to the outside world, probably thinking the worst was over. They had no idea that Jones was about to make a decision that would turn their rescue mission into a massacre. As the group waited at the airstrip for their plane to be ready, Jones was back at the settlement, making frantic preparations for what he called revolutionary suicide. He'd been planning for this moment for months, stockpiling the materials he'd need and conditioning his followers to see death as preferable to capture. It was like he'd been writing the final act of a tragedy and was now ready to stage the performance. The attack at the airstrip came suddenly and without warning. Armed men loyal to Jones opened fire on the delegation, killing Congressman Ryan, 3 journalists and 1 of the defectors. Others were wounded but managed to hide in the jungle until help arrived. It was like a war movie, but real, and it was happening to people who came to help. Back at Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers in the central pavilion and told them that the attack on Ryan's group meant they were now at war with the United States government. He claimed that soldiers would be coming to torture and kill them, and that their only option was to die with dignity on their own terms. It was the ultimate manipulation, using people's fear of a terrible fate to convince them to choose an even worse one. Audio recordings capture the horrific scene that followed. Jones, with his soothing and commanding voice, persuaded hundreds of people to consume a cyanide-laced fruit punch. He presented it as a revolutionary act, a way to make a statement about their commitment to the cause. Parents were told to give it to their children first, to spare them the pain of watching their parents die. Some people resisted, arguing that they should try to escape or fight back instead of giving up. But Jones had spent years conditioning his followers to trust his judgment over their own instincts. He'd created a system where questioning his decisions was seen as disloyalty, and where disloyalty was the worst possible sin. Even in this final moment, many people couldn't bring themselves to defy him. A few survivors later described scenes of absolute horror, people convulsing and dying while Jones continued to speak over the loudspeaker, telling them they were doing something beautiful and revolutionary. Children were crying, parents were screaming, and through it all, Jones kept insisting that the event was a moment of triumph rather than tragedy. Within hours, more than 900 people were dead, including over 300 children. The agricultural project that was supposed to create a better world had become the site of the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. The man who had once preached about love and social justice had led his followers into the ultimate act of destruction. The world was rocked by the news of the Jonestown tragedy. When the first reports came in about a mass suicide in the jungles of Guyana, most people couldn't process what they were hearing. Was the death toll over 900? The death toll included hundreds of children, at the hands of a religious leader who had convinced them to drink poisoned punch. It sounded like something from a horror movie, not something that could happen in real life. The images that emerged from the scene were haunting beyond description. Aerial photographs showed bodies scattered throughout the settlement, families lying together, and children who had died in their parents' arms. It looked like a war zone, except there had been no battle, just a madman's final act of control over people who had trusted him with their lives. The world struggled to understand how such a thing could happen. How could hundreds of intelligent, caring people be convinced to kill themselves and their children? Dismissing them all as crazy or gullible was an easy answer, but it didn't explain how a diverse group of teachers, nurses, social workers, and other professionals could all succumb to the allure of a charismatic leader. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Jones's operation. The People's Temple had been pulling in millions of dollars annually, much of it from social security checks and property sales by members who had turned over their entire lives to the organisation. Jones had used this money to buy political influence, silence critics, and create the infrastructure for his jungle prison. It was like discovering that a charity organisation had really been a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The few survivors who had escaped the final tragedy began to tell their stories, and a picture emerged of systematic psychological manipulation that had taken place over many years. People hadn't just decided one day to follow Jones to Guyana and die for his cause. They'd been gradually conditioned, isolated from outside influences, and broken down until they couldn't trust their judgment anymore. Family members who had lost loved ones at Jonestown found themselves grappling with unfathomable emotions. They were grieving, but they were also angry. At Jones, at themselves for not intervening sooner, and at a system that had allowed such a thing to happen. They had been trying to get their relatives out of the temple for years, but were told they were the ones with the problem and didn't understand the beautiful community their loved ones had found. The psychological community began studying what had happened at Jonestown as a way to understand how mass manipulation works. They identified patterns that Jones had used: love-bombing new recruits, gradually increasing commitment levels, isolating people from outside influences, and creating an us versus them mentality that made questioning the leader feel like betraying the group. What made the Jonestown tragedy particularly disturbing was how Jones had used people's best impulses against them. He'd attracted followers by appealing to their desire for social justice, racial equality, and community service. He'd convinced them that their willingness to sacrifice for others was evidence of their moral superiority. Then he'd gradually redefined sacrifice until it meant giving up everything: their money, their relationships, their autonomy, and finally their lives. The political implications were also significant. Jones had established political connections with prominent politicians who had praised his work with the poor and marginalised. The revelation that he'd been running a cult that ended in mass murder was embarrassing for many public figures who had associated themselves with the People's Temple. It was like discovering that a respected charity had been a front for organised crime. Religious communities also had to grapple with the implications of what had happened. Jones had started as a legitimate minister, and the People's Temple had been affiliated with mainstream Christian denominations. The tragedy raised uncomfortable questions about how religious authority could be abused, and how communities could protect themselves from charismatic leaders who might have dangerous intentions. The media coverage of Jonestown was intense and often sensationalised. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered popular culture as a way to describe blind obedience to authority. Though most people who use the phrase don't realise they're referencing a tragedy where hundreds of children died, it was like turning a mass murder into a cultural meme, which somehow made it feel less real and more distant. The fact that most of the people responsible for the tragedy had already died complicated the legal aftermath. After orchestrating the mass suicide, Jones shot himself, leading to the deaths of many of his top lieutenants. The few survivors who could have faced criminal charges were either obvious victims themselves, or had played such minor roles that prosecution appeared futile. The Guyanese government, which had allowed Jones to establish his settlement, faced questions about how they had been deceived and whether they bore any responsibility for what had happened. They had seen the People's Temple as a legitimate agricultural project that would bring investment and development to a remote area of their country. Instead, they had unknowingly provided the location for one of the most horrific mass murders in history. International law enforcement agencies began to pay more attention to religious movements that operated across national boundaries. The Jonestown tragedy had shown how a cult leader could use multiple countries' jurisdictions to avoid scrutiny and create situations where followers could be completely isolated from help or oversight. Mental health professionals began developing a better understanding of how to help people who had been involved in high-control groups. They learned that survivors often suffered from complex trauma that combined elements of abuse, brainwashing, and survivor's guilt. Recovery required not just healing from the psychological damage, but also rebuilding the ability to trust their own judgment and form healthy relationships. When you truly reflect on Jonestown, it's clear that it wasn't a tale of blatantly evil individuals engaging in blatantly evil actions. It was a story about how good intentions can be weaponized, how the desire to belong can be turned into a trap, and how the very human need for meaning and purpose can be manipulated by someone who understands those needs better than his victims understand them themselves. The people who followed Jim Jones into the jungle weren't stupid or weak. They were teachers and nurses, parents and grandparents, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others and making the world a better place. They were the kind of people you'd want as neighbours, the kind who would bring you soup when you were sick and organise fundraisers for local charities. That's what makes their fate so terrifying. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. In the decades since Jonestown, we've learned a lot about how cults operate, but we haven't necessarily gotten better at preventing them. The internet has made it easier for charismatic leaders to find vulnerable people and gradually draw them into isolated communities. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that reinforce extreme beliefs. The same psychological vulnerabilities that Jones exploited in the 1970s are still present today, just in different forms. The warning signs that experts now recognise were all there in the People's Temple's evolution. The gradual escalation of commitment, the isolation from outside influences, the punishment of questioning, the creation of an us versus them mentality, the increasing control over members' daily lives. These patterns repeat themselves in various forms across different types of high-control groups. What's particularly haunting is how Jones used the language of love and social justice to justify increasingly extreme demands. He convinced people that their willingness to give up their individuality was evidence of their commitment to the collective good. He framed their isolation from family and friends as liberation from toxic relationships. He presented their financial exploitation as generous sharing with the community. It appeared as though he had subverted all positive values. The children who died at Jonestown had no choice in their fate.
They were born into the temple or brought there by parents who genuinely believed they were providing their children with a better life. These kids grew up thinking that Jim Jones was a father figure, that the temple was their family, and that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt. Many trusted their parents when they gave them the poisoned drink, because they were taught to trust adults. The survivors who escaped before the final tragedy have had to live with complex feelings of guilt and loss. They saved themselves, but they couldn't save their friends and family members who stayed behind. They had to rebuild their entire sense of reality after learning that a man they once trusted killed their loved ones. It's like surviving a house fire in which you were unable to save everyone else in the building. The families who lost loved ones at Jonestown have faced a different kind of grief. They've had to mourn people who they felt had abandoned them for the cult, while also dealing with the knowledge that their relatives died as victims of manipulation and abuse. They've had to reconcile their anger at their loved ones' choices with their understanding that those choices were made under extreme psychological pressure. The broader implications of Jonestown continue to resonate today. We live in an era of increasing political polarization, where people are drawn to leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. We see communities forming around shared grievances and shared enemies, where loyalty to the group becomes more important than critical thinking. We watch as people gradually cut ties with family and friends who don't share their beliefs, creating the same kind of isolation that made Jonestown possible. The tragedy also highlighted the importance of maintaining connections to diverse perspectives and outside communities. Those who were most vulnerable to Jones's manipulation were often isolated from family, friends, and other support. When your entire social world revolves around one group and one leader, it becomes almost impossible to maintain perspective on what's normal and what's dangerous. Modern cult experts emphasize that the best protection against manipulation is maintaining what they call distributed trust, having relationships and commitments that span multiple communities and contexts. When you place all your trust in a single entity, you expose yourself to the control of that entity. But when your life includes family, friends, work colleagues, hobby groups, and other connections, it's much harder for any single person or organisation to gain total control over your thinking. The Jonestown tragedy also showed how important it is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly what's bothering you. Many people who eventually escaped from the temple later said they had felt uneasy about certain things for months or years before they finally decided to leave. But they had been trained to dismiss those feelings as weakness, selfishness, or lack of faith in the cause. In our current information environment, where we're constantly bombarded with conflicting messages about what's true and what's important, the lessons of Jonestown are more relevant than ever. We need to be able to think critically about the sources of our information, to maintain relationships with people who might challenge our assumptions, and to trust our judgment when something doesn't feel right. The story of Jonestown is ultimately about the fragility of human judgment and the importance of the communities that help us maintain our sense of reality. It serves as a reminder that isolation from outside perspectives and systematic manipulation can lead even the most intelligent and well-meaning individuals astray, but it's also about the human spirit's resilience and the bravery needed to escape toxic or dangerous situations.
You're settling in for the night, maybe with a cup of chamomile tea or that last bit of wine from dinner, and your mind starts wandering to one of history's most frustrating puzzles. Not the kind that keeps you up staring at the ceiling, more like the kind that makes you feel pleasantly drowsy, while your brain does that gentle tumbling thing it does when it's processing something intriguing but not urgent. The lost colony of Roanoke. Over the years, you've likely heard fragments of information about the lost colony of Roanoke, perhaps seen a documentary about it, or come across a mention in some historical fiction. But there's something deliciously unsettling about the whole thing that makes it perfect for this quiet moment before sleep. Not scary, unsettling. More like the feeling you get when you realise you've misplaced your reading glasses and then spend 10 minutes looking for them while they're sitting on top of your head. Picture this. It's 1587 and you're part of a group of English settlers heading to what would eventually become North Carolina. You're probably wearing uncomfortable clothes, your teeth could use some serious dental work, and the boat ride has been exactly as pleasant as you'd expect from a 16th century ocean voyage. But you're hopeful. You're starting fresh in a new world, building something from scratch, maybe leaving behind some drama or debt or just the general stuffiness of Elizabethan England. Your leader is a fellow named John White. Not the most charismatic name in history, admittedly, but he seems decent enough. He's actually an artist, which is rather sweet when you think about it. Rather than a stern military leader, you have someone who observes the way light interacts with water and likely enjoys sketching birds in his free time. White has been to this area before, so he knows the territory, sort of. Well, he thinks he does. The plan is straightforward. Establish a colony, grow some crops, trade with the local Croatoan people who seem reasonably friendly, and eventually create a thriving English settlement. Simple enough, right? You've brought families this time, men, women, children, even a pregnant woman named Eleanor, who happens to be John White's daughter. This is not an expedition filled with soldiers and fortune seekers. This town is meant to be a real community, with people planning to put down roots and build actual lives. And for a little while, things go okay. Not great. Nothing ever goes great when you're essentially camping in the wilderness while trying to construct civilization from scratch. But okay, you build some houses, plant some gardens, and meet some neighbours. Eleanor gives birth to a little girl named Virginia Dare, who becomes the first English child born in North America. There's something both hopeful and slightly ominous about that distinction, though you don't know it yet. But then problems start cropping up, the way they always do when people are stressed and living in close quarters with limited resources. Food supplies are running lower than expected. Some of the neighbouring indigenous groups are less welcoming than hoped, partly because previous English visitors hadn't exactly been model guests. There are misunderstandings, tensions, and the occasional skirmish. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make everyone a bit jumpy. John White finds himself in an impossible position. The colony needs supplies, food, tools, medicine, all the things you can't exactly improvise in the wilderness. Someone has to go back to England to get help, and the leader is obviously him. But leaving means abandoning his daughter and brand new granddaughter, along with everyone else who's counting on him. It's the kind of decision that would give anyone stress dreams. Stay and watch everyone slowly starve, or get picked off by various dangers, or leave and hope you can make it back before something terrible happens. White chooses to leave, promising to return as quickly as possible with supplies and reinforcements. As his ship disappears over the horizon, you're left standing on the shore with about 115 other colonists, watching your lifeline sail away. The ocean looks huge suddenly, and England feels very far away. But you're committed now. This is home, for better or worse. You settle into a routine of sorts, tending crops, maintaining buildings, and trying to establish better relationships with your neighbours. Days pass, then weeks, then months. Winter comes and goes. Spring arrives. You keep expecting to see ships on the horizon, but the horizon remains stubbornly empty. One day you come to a startling realization. John White has been gone for nearly 3 years. Where is he? 3 years. You've been counting because it helps maintain the illusion that time is still moving in a predictable way, that there's still a connection to the world you came from. 3 years since you watched John White's ship disappear, taking with it your main link to supplies, reinforcements, and news from home. At first, everyone had reasonable explanations for the delay. Ocean voyages were unpredictable. Storms, pirates, navigation errors, and mechanical problems. Ships sank with depressing regularity in those days. Maybe White's vessel had been damaged and needed extensive repairs. Maybe he'd had trouble convincing investors to fund a return voyage. Maybe Queen Elizabeth had other priorities. There were always wars or political crises or economic troubles that could divert attention and resources. You'd developed little rituals around watching for ships. Someone would climb the tallest tree each morning to scan the horizon. Others would take evening walks along the beach, squinting at distant clouds that might, from the right angle and with enough wishful thinking, look like sails. Children made games of it, competing to be the first to spot the rescue ships that never came. But as months stretched into years, those hopeful habits began to feel hollow. The morning tree climbing became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Beach walks continued, but more for exercise and contemplation than for ship spotting. The children found other games. During this endless waiting period, you've learned things about yourself and your fellow colonists that you never expected to discover. You've learned that Margaret Harrison has an absolutely filthy sense of humour when she thinks no one important is listening. You've discovered that Thomas Cooper, who seemed like such a practical, level-headed fellow back in England, becomes completely irrational when he can't find his favourite hammer. You've watched Eleanor White-Dare transform from a nervous new mother into someone who could probably run a small government if necessary. The colony has developed its own rhythms, its own internal politics, and its own little dramas and alliances. People have paired off, broken up, reconciled, argued over garden boundaries, shared recipes, borrowed tools, and gossiped about each other's laundry habits. It's become a real community, which is both comforting and slightly tragic under the circumstances. Your relationship with the Croatoan people has evolved too, though it's complicated. Some individuals have been genuinely helpful, sharing knowledge about local plants, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. Others remain suspicious or hostile, and you can hardly blame them. Your presence represents a permanent change to their world, whether you intended it or not. The language barrier creates endless opportunities for misunderstandings, some amusing, and others less so. You've learned to recognize certain words and phrases, and developed a basic vocabulary of gestures and expressions that help with simple communications. But nuanced conversations remain nearly impossible, which means you're never quite sure where you stand with your neighbours. Food has become an ongoing source of low-level anxiety. You've learned to eat things you never imagined consuming, roots, berries, and various aquatic creatures that look like they belonged in a medieval bestiary rather than on a dinner plate. Some of these discoveries have been pleasant surprises. Others have been less pleasant. You've developed a healthy respect for the trial and error process of identifying edible plants, especially after Thomas Cooper's unfortunate encounter with what everyone now refers to as the incident with the purple berries. The seasons have become more meaningful than they ever were back in England. You notice changes in daylight, temperature, and weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose life actually depends on such things. You've learned to read the sky, to predict storms, and to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for winter. Your sleeping patterns have changed too. Without candles to waste or oil lamps to maintain, you've fallen into a rhythm that follows natural light more closely. You sleep deeper and wake more naturally, though your dreams have become more vivid and sometimes strange. Maybe it's the diet, or the stress, or just the way your brain processes this surreal situation of being possibly forgotten by the entire civilized world. But the most unsettling realization is this. You've stopped talking about when the rescue ships arrive and started talking about if they arrive. It's a small change in language, but it represents a massive shift in thinking. You're no longer temporary residents waiting for transportation home. You're permanent settlers who may never see England again. The question that keeps surfacing, usually late at night, when you're lying awake listening to unfamiliar sounds in the darkness, is this. What happens if no one ever comes? By the 4th year, you've all implicitly accepted the reality that no one wants to publicly express. You're on your own. John White isn't coming back, at least not anytime soon, and possibly not ever. The reasons don't matter anymore. War, shipwreck, political upheaval, financial problems, or maybe he simply got distracted by some other opportunity. The result is the same either way. This realization has brought a strange kind of relief along with the obvious anxiety. The waiting is over. Certainty about abandonment has replaced the uncertainty about rescue, and working with certainty, even unpleasant certainty, is easier than endless hope. You can make plans now, real plans, instead of just marking time until someone else solves your problems. The colony's leadership has shifted subtly but noticeably. Without an appointed governor, decisions get made by consensus, argument, or sometimes just by whoever feels strongly enough about something to take charge. Eleanor White-Dare has emerged as a natural leader, partly because she's John White's daughter, and partly because she's simply adept at organising people and resources. Her daughter Virginia, now a walking, talking 4-year-old, has become everyone's child, a living symbol of the colony's commitment to staying put. You've also had to confront some uncomfortable realities about your situation. Food security remains problematic. You've learned to cultivate local crops and preserve seasonal abundance, but you're always one disastrous harvest or severe winter away from serious trouble. The indigenous neighbours continue to be unpredictable, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, always operating according to social rules you don't fully understand. Your housing situation has evolved from temporary shelters to more permanent structures. But permanent is relative when you're working with local materials and limited tools. Roofs leak, walls warp, and foundations settle in unexpected ways. Everything requires constant maintenance, which might be normal for colonial life, but it feels particularly precarious when you realise there's no possibility of ordering replacement materials from England. Medical care has become a community responsibility handled by a combination of folk remedies, trial and error, and prayer. Margaret Harrison turned out to have a knack for healing, probably based on knowledge she'd picked up from her grandmother back home, combined with careful observation of what works and what doesn't. But serious injuries or illnesses remain terrifying because there's no doctor, no pharmacy, and no hospital within several thousand miles. The psychological adjustment has been harder than the practical challenges. You've grieved the life you left behind, not just the people and places, but the assumptions about how the world works. In England, you were part of a complex, established society with rules, institutions, and safety nets. Here, you're essentially making up civilization as you go along, which is both liberating and exhausting. Some colonists have adapted better than others. A few have thrived in this environment, discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. Others have struggled with depression, anxiety, or what we might now recognize as PTSD from the constant stress of survival. There's been at least one suicide, and several people have simply wandered off into the wilderness, either deliberately or because they became confused and disoriented. But here's the thing that keeps you awake sometimes, staring up at stars that seem brighter and more numerous than they ever did back home. You've started to suspect that staying might not be entirely voluntary anymore. You've evolved in ways that could make reintegrating into English society challenging or unfeasible, not due to any external force holding you captive. You've learned to track animals, identify medicinal plants, predict weather patterns, and navigate by natural landmarks. You've developed relationships with people whose names you can't properly pronounce but whose faces have become as familiar as family. You've adapted to a rhythm of life that follows seasons rather than clocks and natural light rather than artificial schedules. Would you even fit back into English society now? Could you readjust to having neighbours you've never spoken to buying food instead of growing it, and to following laws made by people who live hundreds of miles away? Would people value the skills you've developed here, such as patience, resourcefulness, and the ability to find solutions using only what's immediately available? Or would they view them as eccentricities? And there's Virginia to consider. She's never known any world but this one. England would be as foreign to her as this place once was to you. She speaks English, but she also knows Croatoan words and gestures. She's equally comfortable with European games and indigenous traditions. She belongs here in a way that you're still learning. The question isn't just about survival anymore. It's about identity, belonging, and what home means when the place you came from is now more foreign than the one you've made. But the alternative, staying put and hoping tensions resolve themselves, feels increasingly unrealistic. There's been talk of violence, rumours of coordinated action against the colony, reports of weapons being gathered, and alliances being formed. You don't know how much of this is accurate intelligence and how much is anxiety-fueled speculation, but you can't afford to assume the best-case scenario. The decision gets made gradually, then suddenly. Someone suggests that advanced scouts should visit Croatoan Island to assess the situation and begin negotiations. Someone else volunteers to start organising supplies for a potential move. A third person begins making lists of what's essential and what can be left behind. Before anyone officially declares that the colony is relocating, everyone's acting as if the decision has already been made. You find yourself caught up in the strange energy of dismantling a life you've spent years building. Possessions get sorted into piles. Absolutely necessary, probably useful, would be nice to have and might as well leave it. The process is both liberating and heartbreaking. You're shedding not just objects, but attachments, memories, the physical evidence of your attempts to create permanence in an impermanent world. Some colonists are handling the transition better than others. A few seem almost excited about the prospect of starting fresh somewhere new, treating it as an adventure rather than an evacuation. Others are clearly struggling with what feels like another abandonment, Another failure to establish the stable community they'd hoped to create. There's grief mixed with the practical preparations, a sense of loss that nobody wants to dwell on, because dwelling on it might make the necessary action impossible. The children are adapting with the resilience that children somehow manage to summon for situations that would break most adults. Virginia Dare, now approaching her 5th birthday, treats the whole thing as an elaborate game of packing and unpacking, helping to sort items while chattering about the boat ride and the new place where they'll live. Her cheerfulness is both encouraging and slightly devastating. As departure day approaches, you realise you're about to become part of one of history's great mysteries, though you have no way of knowing that yet. You're just people trying to survive, making the best decisions you can with incomplete information and limited options. But someone, someday, is going to want to know what happened to you. You've left clues because you're not stupid. Despite the chaos and urgency of packing up an entire community, despite the stress of negotiating safe passage with people who speak a different language, despite the 100 practical concerns that come with essentially becoming refugees in your own adopted homeland, you've thought about the future. Specifically, you've thought about John White. He might still come back. Probably not, but possibly, and if he does, he's going to find an empty settlement with no indication of what happened to the people he left behind. That would be cruel, leaving him to imagine the worst: massacre, starvation, disease, or some other catastrophe that wiped out his daughter, granddaughter, and everyone else he'd sworn to protect. So, you've left messages. It's not just you alone, but a team of individuals collaborating to guarantee that any potential searchers will discover solutions rather than merely enigmas. The most obvious message is carved into a post near the fort. Croatoan. It's simple, clear, and should be understandable to anyone familiar with the area. If John White returns, he'll know you've gone to Croatoan Island, and he'll know you went there voluntarily rather than under duress. There's also another carving, just CRO, on a nearby tree. We added this one partly as a backup, and partly because Thomas Cooper became enthusiastic about the carving project and wanted to contribute his own handiwork. It's less informative than the main message, but it reinforces the direction you've gone. The plan was to include more detailed information, perhaps a letter left in a waterproof container, or additional carvings explaining the circumstances of your departure. But time ran out faster than expected. The situation with your neighbours deteriorated more quickly than anyone anticipated, and what was supposed to be a carefully planned relocation became something closer to an urgent evacuation. You'd also discussed establishing some kind of signal system, perhaps arrange stones or mark trees that could guide rescue parties from the original settlement to your new location. But again, the reality of moving over 100 people with limited transportation and uncertain welcome made such elaborate precautions impossible. The departure itself was both more and less dramatic than you'd imagined. More dramatic because loading people and supplies into small boats while everyone's nervous about potentially hostile observers creates a lot of tension and shouting. Less dramatic because it was mostly just logistics. Who sits where, which boxes go in which boat, and how to keep the children calm and the adults from panicking. Eleanor insisted on one last walk through the settlement before leaving, taking Virginia with her to see the place where she'd been born. It was both sentimental and practical, making sure nothing essential had been forgotten, saying goodbye to a place that had been home for several years, and creating a memory that Virginia might carry forward even if she never sees this spot again. You found yourself doing the same thing, taking a final inventory of the structures you'd helped build, the gardens you'd helped plant, and the improvements you'd made to what had been wilderness when you first arrived. It wasn't sentiment exactly, but it wasn't entirely practical either. Maybe it was just the human need to acknowledge the significance of endings, to mark the transition between one phase of life and whatever comes next. The boat ride to Croatoan Island was long enough to give everyone time to think about what they were leaving behind and what they might be heading toward. Some people spent the journey looking back at the coastline that had been home, watching it shrink into the distance. Others faced forward, trying to spot their destination and imagine what life might be like in their new location. A few just closed their eyes and tried not to think about anything at all. Virginia fell asleep in her mother's arms partway through the voyage, lulled by the motion of the boat and the sound of water against the hull. Watching her sleep, so completely trusting that the adults around her would handle whatever needed to be handled, you felt the weight of responsibility that comes with making decisions that will shape someone else's entire future. You have made every effort to create a trail that any reasonable search party could follow. You've chosen a destination that offers the best available chance for survival and prosperity. You've maintained the unity of the community despite stress and uncertainty. You've made the hard choices that needed to be made. But, as the familiar coastline disappears behind you, and the unknown shoreline grows larger ahead, you can't shake the feeling that you're not just changing locations. You're disappearing from history, becoming part of a story that no one will ever be able to complete. The messages you left behind feel suddenly inadequate, too simple for the complexity of what's actually happening. Croatoan Island is both exactly what you expected and completely different from what you'd imagined. The physical landscape is familiar: sandy beaches, maritime forests, and the same plants and animals you'd learned to recognize over the past several years. But the social landscape is entirely new, and navigating it requires skills you're still developing. Though the term welcoming might be too strong, your hosts have been more welcoming than you'd dared to hope. Tolerant might be more accurate, or perhaps cautiously accommodating. While you negotiate longer-term arrangements, they've allowed you to establish temporary shelters and shared information about local resources, seasonal patterns, and potential hazards. But there's an underlying tension in these interactions, a sense that your presence here is provisional rather than permanent. The language barrier remains frustrating, though you're all getting better at the basic communications necessary for daily cooperation. You've learned to recognize words for common objects, actions, and concepts. More importantly, you've learned to read facial expressions, body language, and social cues that transcend specific vocabulary. You're developing a kind of intuitive understanding of when to approach someone with a request, when to offer help, and when to stay out of the way entirely. Virginia has adapted most quickly, as children always seem to do in these situations. She's picked up fragments of Croatoan language with the effortless facility that makes adults simultaneously envious and proud. She plays with local children using a combination of English words, Croatoan phrases, and the universal language of games that somehow transcends cultural boundaries. Watching her, you can see glimpses of what successful integration might look like, though you also realize it might take a generation to achieve. The practical challenges of establishing a new community have been complicated by the need to coordinate with existing residents who have their own established patterns, preferences, and priorities. You can't just clear land and build wherever seems convenient. You have to negotiate for space, for resources, and for permission to alter the landscape in ways that might affect other people. It's like trying to renovate a house while the original owners are still living in it and haven't entirely decided they want you as permanent housemates. Food sharing has become a complex social ritual that you're still learning to navigate properly. To contribute to communal meals, you must know what's available, how it's prepared, and who provides what, when, and how much. There are protocols around hunting, fishing, and gathering that seem to involve seasonal restrictions, territorial boundaries, and hierarchical privileges that nobody has explicitly explained to you, but which you're expected to somehow intuit. The most delicate negotiations have involved marriage customs and family structures. Several of your fellow colonists are single, and some have expressed interest in local partners, but the social rules governing such relationships are complicated and culturally specific. There have been a few tentative courtships, some successful and others less so, all of which have required careful diplomacy to avoid creating conflicts that could jeopardize the entire community's welcome. You've also had to confront the reality that some aspects of English colonial culture are simply incompatible with Croatoan social norms. Your assumptions about property ownership, individual autonomy, and social hierarchy don't translate directly, and insisting on English ways of doing things would be both impractical and politically unwise. You're learning to be more flexible, more observant, and more willing to adapt your behavior to fit circumstances rather than expecting them to accommodate your preferences. But the strangest part of this integration process is the gradual realization that you're not just learning to live with different people, you're becoming different people yourselves. The stress of relocation, the challenge of cultural adaptation, and the daily necessity of cooperation have changed how you think, how you solve problems, how you relate to each other, and how you relate to the environment. You've developed new skills, new perspectives, and new priorities. Things that seemed critically important back in the original settlement, maintaining English customs, preserving European social distinctions, and planning for eventual return to civilization, have faded in significance. What matters now is immediate survival, successful cooperation, and the gradual construction of a hybrid community that draws from multiple cultural traditions without being entirely constrained by any of them. Late at night, lying in your temporary shelter listening to unfamiliar sounds and familiar voices, you sometimes wonder if the person you're becoming would be recognizable to the person who first arrived in the new world. You've travelled not just geographically, but also culturally, linguistically, and perhaps even psychologically. You're becoming someone new, someone who exists in the spaces between established identities. And Virginia, growing up in this hybrid world, will be something entirely unprecedented. A person who belongs fully to neither English nor Croatoan culture, but to both simultaneously. Years pass, and you gradually stop thinking of yourself as English colonists, temporarily residing among the Croatoan people. The distinction has blurred beyond recognition through daily cooperation, intermarriage, shared hardships, and the simple passage of time. Children born here, including Virginia, now a young woman who speaks Croatoan as fluently as English, belong to this place in ways that the original settlers never quite managed. You've become part of the community's seasonal rhythms, participating in ceremonies and traditions that would have seemed foreign and possibly threatening when you first arrived. You've learned to make tools, clothing, and medicines using local materials and traditional techniques. More importantly, you've learned to think like someone whose survival depends on intimate knowledge of local conditions rather than imported solutions. The original English settlement feels like something that happened to different people in a different lifetime. When you occasionally think about John White, or wonder whether any ships ever return to look for you, it's with the detached curiosity you might feel about historical events that don't directly affect your current life. The emotional urgency of rescue has faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of the community you've actually built. But lately, you've been having conversations, quiet, private conversations, about visibility and invisibility, about what it means to vanish from one world while becoming part of another. Some of the older colonists are concerned about the stories people will tell about your disappearance and the assumptions they will make about your fate. The idea that people who never knew the truth might interpret your successful adaptation as failure or tragedy is unsettling. Virginia has started asking questions about her origins, about the English grandfather she never met, and about the difference between the family she was born into and the family she's grown up with. Her questions stem not from dissatisfaction with her current life, but rather from the innate human curiosity about identity and belonging. She wants to understand not just who she is, but how she came to be who she is. These conversations have made you realize that you've become custodians of a story that will probably never be told accurately. The people who might someday investigate your disappearance will have access to the carved messages you left behind, but they won't have access to the complex social, political, and personal factors that made relocation necessary and integration possible. They'll find mystery where you experienced practical problem solving. You've also realized that the very success of your adaptation makes your story less visible to outside observers. If you'd all died dramatically, there might be obvious evidence: bones, abandoned belongings, signs of conflict or disaster. If you'd maintained a separate English community, there might be recognizable cultural artifacts, architectural remains, or other traces that clearly indicated European presence. But by integrating successfully, you've essentially disappeared into the existing cultural landscape. Your children and grandchildren will carry forward fragments of English language, customs, and knowledge, but these will be woven into a larger cultural fabric that wouldn't necessarily be recognized as having European origins. A few words, some techniques for working with metal or preserving food, and stories about places across the ocean might persist for generations, without anyone recognizing them as evidence of the lost colony's fate. Sometimes, lying awake in the quiet hours before dawn, you imagine future historians puzzling over your disappearance. They'll have theories: disease, massacre, starvation, failed attempt to return to England. They'll analyse the carved messages, search for archaeological evidence, create elaborate explanations for what seems to them like an inexplicable vanishing. They'll never consider the most mundane and most profound possibility, that you simply became part of something larger than yourselves. The irony is that your story isn't really mysterious at all, at least not from the inside. You made rational decisions based on available information and circumstances. You adapted to survive, cooperated to thrive, and integrated because separation was neither practical nor desirable. You became invisible to history precisely because you became visible to your neighbours, accepted by your community, and successful in ways that don't leave obvious traces for future archaeologists to discover. But you understand now that mystery isn't always about what's unknown. Sometimes it's about what's unknowable from the outside, what can only be understood through lived experience rather than historical investigation. You've become part of a story that can't be solved like a puzzle because it was never broken in the first place. As you drift towards sleep, lulled by familiar sounds from a world that's become truly home, you find yourself hoping that somewhere, somehow, the people who wonder about your fate will eventually realise that the best possible ending to any story about lost colonists is that they were never really lost at all. They just found something better than what they were looking for.